Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 3rd of March 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Well, the sun in Plymouth has been so hot, I've obviously had to put on a white shirt to reflect some of that heat. And the reports are sunshine in Pembrokeshire. London's looking pretty good. Inverclyde is looking reasonably sunny. But apparently Manchester is cold and grey. So that's the weather.
Straight into the EU then.
Cheer people up.
Yep, here we go. David Lidington. Don't know if anybody's ever heard of this, unless you're living in Aylesbury, of course. He's the MP for Aylesbury. He's also Minister of State for Europe. And he has, according to the Foreign Office, signed the EU referendum date into law. So there you go.
He has signed it.
He has, yes, he has.
Okay.
There you go. What more can you say? In the meantime, of course, David Cameron is over in France speaking to François Hollande. And in time for that, of course, more fear because France is saying basically if Britain leaves the EU, the Calais migrant crisis is going to get worse. Lots of more people because they're going to come into this country unchecked at Calais. So that's great. So there you go. But anyway, Cameron and Hollande, they're expected to sign agreements on defence, more defence agreements with the French without any kind of political oversight or parliamentary approval.
I think we'll be explaining a bit of that later in the news.
Okay. Agreements on terrorism, because apparently Britain and France are going to make some agreements about terrorism. And the construction of the Hinkley Point nuclear reactor, of course. As part of this defence thing, maybe you're going to be mentioning this, but this article here pointing out 7,000 strong joint expeditionary force. Brilliant. So there we go. I am convinced that the UK's membership of the EU gives us greater security and greater capacity to project power globally, according to King David. So there you go. Well, now, just as a reminder, of course, the civil service continues to pump out documents on this, and none of them anti-EU or none of them in any way balanced. So this one is alternatives to membership, possible models for the United Kingdom outside the European Union. But despite having, 460,000 people working for the civil service, apparently no one can come up with a model which would be original. So they're really pushing these three potential models for what are the alternatives to the EU. And of course, according to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Civil Service, they're all bad for us. So one might be the Norway model, one might be the bilateral model, one might be the World Trade Organization model, and all of them, they require accepting free movement of people. They require paying into the EU budget, despite the fact it hasn't been audited for goodness knows how many years. And all of them except the World Trade Organization option, which they say would result in additional tariffs on UK exports to the EU, more red tape and higher prices. But that's according to that document. But unfortunately, of course, if you actually have a look at what the trade situation is with the EU at the moment, we find that the trade deficit with the EU is the largest it's been on record. So in fact, if Britain was to leave the EU from a trade perspective, that would be much worse for Europe than it would be for Britain.
Which is what many people have been saying for a very long time, Mike.
Indeed. So this whole argument is nonsense, but then that's part of the PSYOP. And also tweeted out today by the UK government, TTIP. Now, as I was trying to make with regard to this is, of course, TTIP is, as they state in their documentation, absolutely central to UK government policy. And if you read the Best of Both Worlds document, what you find is that TTIP is absolutely highlighted in that as being one of the advantages of staying in the EU. In fact, whether we stay or whether we go, this remains UK government policy. And if we vote to stay in the European Union, we are voting for this.
What I find fascinating on that slide, Mike, sorry.
Yeah, okay, I'll put it back up, yeah.
That's it, is here we've got the Union Jack, we've got Union flag there with UK government. So we see our national flag just disappearing off documents. But now we've got the EU referendum coming up and we're trying to push this the inference is, here we are, good solid Tories backing Britain.
Well, that looks to me more like a corporate brand than anything else.
Well, UK PLC,
Indeed.
you mean, the city. Yeah.
This was a fascinating little article. Swiss lawmakers have voted to pull the forgotten EU application. So apparently in Switzerland, they had made an application to join the European Union, but it seems to have never really proceeded. The foreign minister has said that, in fact, it was already void since 1992. So this motion that's been put in the Swiss parliament to drop it, they're saying is unnecessary. But nonetheless, Swiss lawmakers, as they're being described here, wanting to make the point that they certainly don't want to be, no matter what was sort of thought about at some point in the past, they do not want to be part of the European Union. And the motion was entitled EU Membership Achieving Clarity. It's now going to go to the Senate for review. Well,
How has this little country managed to survive outside the EU, Mike? I mean, we're being told by Mr. Cameron that nobody can survive outside the EU.
Well, in fairness, they probably have significant gold reserves belonging to most of the heads of government of EU nations and so on.
Small point.
Yeah.
We'll be on to the Bank of International Settlements in a minute.
Yeah.
Well, we will in due course. Well, we were very interested in this article, which we had missed previously, but here we are. A London council, Havering, with a sizable proportion of UKIP councillors, voted in the last couple of days in favour of leaving the EU. And the general comment about this is, well done those people, because they've brought the debate right where it should be, in front of the public, and they got that result. Here's the vote, 30 to 15 in favour of a motion declaring the UK would be better off outside the EU. But this is the interesting part of this article, is just to have a look at what the BBC journalist does with it. This is the first comment. But here we have an elected body that's supposed to focus on local services, taking sides in a national debate over Britain's future in Europe. This is just outrageous, because these people are doing what they should do, because as these councillors have pointed out, the EU is costing them money. But the good old BBC goes on, but scrutiny of the wording of the motion voted on reveals it claimed EU directives had a negative impact on the ability and cost of Havering Council to fulfil its obligations. Then there's the stab in the back. There is no mention of the EU funding that Havering has benefited from over the years, thought to be almost 2 million since 2005. So this journalist is so lazy, I'll put her face on screen in a minute, can't even do the research as to what money they did get from the EU. But of course the point is that it was matched funding anyway, so the local council had to come up with an equivalent sum. And where did the money in the EU come from? It had been donated largely by the British taxpayer. So here she is, Susana Mendonça. She tells you that you've got to pronounce her name correctly. I'm not sure where she's from, but classic biased, misleading reporting by the BBC. And as we lead into some of the heavier subjects in the news, I'm going to thank this lady, Marina, who sent me a YouTube video, which is a very, very interesting analysis of the role of the BBC in achieving the coup in Iran, which of course deposed the Shah and started all sorts of trouble in that area. And this was very interesting, because Marina picked up on the UK column article about the BBC's subversive charity media action. And inset on your screens at the moment, you've got some of the articles, including 2 by your good self, Mike, about what the BBC actually gets up to. So at the moment, as far as UK columns concerned, the BBC is doing what it does best, sheer propaganda, in order to reinforce the idea that we stay in Europe. And if we're talking about Europe, and he's been mentioned, let's bring in our king. This is King Cameron. Now, of course, a little while ago, it came to light that he'd been using the civil service to fabricate basically a letter as if it came from senior military officers, Unfortunately, he chose the name of some of them that didn't agree with the idea of staying in Europe. So this was a scam, it was a lie, it was deceit, deliberate by David Cameron and the civil service, of course. And we thought we'd contrast it with some of the comments from senior military officers. This is Colonel Richard Kemp, and he says the most important weapon in the fight against terrorism is intelligence, yet there is and can be no viable EU intelligence sharing mechanism. Now that statement aligns with a little bit of discussion that I had with Alex day before yesterday, because we were actually pointing out that within NATO, very little real information is shared with other NATO countries. It's principally UK, US. The Dutch get some, Germans get a little bit, French sit on the sidelines, and the reason is they're not trusted. That's the hard fact of how the system works. But the comments go on. We've got here Richard Walton, former head counter-terrorism, New Scotland Yard. He said membership of the EU does not really convey any benefits that we couldn't access if we were outside it. And former Royal Marine General Julian Thompson said what keeps us safe is not the European Union, but rather our role in NATO. It is rubbish to suggest that the EU would protect us from terror attacks. So that's pretty hardline stuff, Mike, but of course we're seeing no proper analysis of this sort of comment, certainly not within the BBC.
Okay, UK against Assad. This should really be, this Twitter account should really be labelled. This is a Foreign Office Twitter account, UK against Daesh. The international community has adopted legally binding measures to combat illicit trafficking of antiquities and cultural objects from Iraq and Syria, and I think, well, that's great, isn't it? What is the, I mean, it's fair enough that this sort of thing should be stopped, but what are they doing about oil? And of course the answer is absolutely nothing. This is an hilarious article in the Financial Times in one sense, but there are a couple of little nuggets of information that provide interest to what we're talking about here. They say in recent weeks the jihadi group, that's ISIS, has offered traders a license to buy up to 1,000 barrels of oil at a time as the lucrative Al Omar oil field, at the lucrative Al Omar oil field, a deal which would have been unheard of before the US-led coalition launched an aggressive air campaign against the financial assets of ISIS late last year. Were you aware of that? I wasn't. I thought it was the Russians, strangely enough. But anyway, nonetheless, production, as the FT has to admit here, production continues as it has. However, the prices stay as they were, and the coalition keeps striking just like it has. In other words, they keep missing. But when the strikes hit, the selling stops for a while, and then people get back to work. So that's how successful the Western strikes have been on ISIS oil. So we're busy apparently claiming success at stopping ancient artifacts coming out of Iraq and Syria, but we're doing nothing about the real source of the finance for this organisation.
Well, of course, that's absolutely true, Mark. I think it's also true to say that, of course, all of the important artifacts have already been stripped out of Iraq and were within a matter of months of the fighting. Museums were suddenly emptied. And it is suggested that a lot of those artefacts were of some significance to the financial interests of UK, so they came back pretty quickly. The country trashed, assets stolen, and now we've got a similar pattern in Syria, all being driven, of course, by the US and the UK, with Saudi in the background.
Indeed. Now, Vanessa Bailey is in Geneva at the moment at the United Nations, and I want to encourage everybody to read her report, which is on 21st Century Wire, about this. She's saying the UN World Food Programme, she was commenting really on some of the stuff that we've commented on over the last couple of days at the beginning of this. The UN World Food Programme aids for the restricted Syrian civilians in Deir ez-Zor city have landed mostly on ISIS-controlled territories, a source in the city's administration said on Thursday. And she talks a little bit about that and then talks about what she has witnessed while she's been at the United Nations. And she says the UN Human Rights Commission was perfectly described yesterday as the polished diamond of Western foreign policy. It is the optic through which we are directed to view our government's imperialism, While our governments rape, pillage and plunder under the banner of democracy, the UN Human Rights Commission soothes our troubled soul by creating the illusion of caring two hoots about the peoples devastated by the aggressive colonialist policies. So she's not holding any punches back, but nonetheless, go and read this because it's an extremely interesting article about what she's witnessed while she's been there.
Right, and these, of course, are reports of people who do know what's going on, as opposed to other journalists who are simply pulling it off the internet.
Indeed.
Well, let's come to the bad man, the man who was going to eat our children. We're obviously talking about President Putin. And things are getting very, very interesting now, because apparently the migrant crisis is as a result of Russia and Syria weaponizing migration. When I read this, Mike, I didn't really laugh, but this is propaganda which is so blatant and so pathetic, it's almost difficult to describe without a laugh. Well, of course, it's not just the BBC in this case, because here's the Telegraph. NATO chief has said Vladimir Putin is weaponizing the refugee crisis to break Europe. It's really astonishing, isn't it? So let's have a look. We've got President Putin who steps in to attack terrorists, and he so successfully starts to stop the conflict, which was started and fueled by the US, UK, EU, and Saudi. He's the bad guy. Nobody wants to talk about this man. Here he is, Peter Sutherland, with lots of letters after his name, who said in 2012 that the EU should be doing its best to encourage mass migration to undermine the homogeneity of European countries.
This is British policy, British foreign policy.
So here is the foreign policy. How have they encouraged the migration? By attacking, destroying the infrastructure of Syria so that people are on the move. And now it's happening. Oh dear, we're in a little bit of a spot, so we're going to blame it on President Putin. I'll just make an amendment to the header on there. We've got desperation of the Obama-Cameron cabal. Well, of course, it's not Putin, it's that nasty EU that's responsible for the migration. Well, this is the man causing the furore. Here he is, General Philip Breedlove. Have we been a bit extreme with that title? Well, you can make up your own minds, but we're suggesting that he's now branding anybody who is supporting UKIP as a potential violent terrorist. And he's also called for more US troops. Sorry, that should be US troops rather than EU troops. Maybe there's not much difference between them, Mike, in Europe. So here we are. ISIS is spreading like a cancer amongst refugees. Now, that statement itself has been hotly disputed or denied by organisations helping refugees. But he says refugees from the Middle East and North Africa are masking the movement of terrorists and criminals. So this is what he's pumping into Congress. Islamic State terror group is spreading like a cancer amongst the refugees. Russia's bombing campaign in support of Assad has wildly exacerbated the problem. Those nasty Russians, they've caused this whole problem. And Kremlin and Assad intend to use migration as a weapon to weaken European unity and infrastructure. And here's the killer: European nationalist groups that oppose immigration also weaken the continent and could themselves threaten violence. So there you are. If you're a UKIP, according to this American general, you are a potential terrorist and a troublemaker. Well, let's follow it through because it gets better. He continues. He says that they were deliberately weaponizing the migration in an attempt to overwhelm European structures and break European resolve. So these people living in tents, no possessions, travelling thousands of miles in horrible conditions, this is all a weapon. And then he says, well, of course, this has all been caused by barrel bombs and unguided weapons against civilians in Syria. And the only purpose of those attacks was to terrorise Syrian citizens and get them on the road to create problems for other countries. This is cartoon stuff, Mike. Absolute. And of course, no evidence for barrel bombs being used by Assad in the first place. Never any evidence, which we highlighted. And he added that violent extremists, fighters and criminals, including elements from the extremist Islamic State group, were in the mix of migrants. And he's requested, here we are, more US forces to be permanently based in Europe because they've dropped from about 500,000 during the Cold War to a mere 62,000. So we're just going to say in here, when challenged by journalists at that briefing for backing for the information and data, he was simply unable to do so. So this is rhetoric. And I just had to say that this was a wonderful response to the tweet I put out about this. So John Phillips said, I thought we'd outgrown the old "a big boy did it and ran away" excuse. So thank you very much for making us smile on that one. But this is what's really going on in the background, and this is why the propaganda over the EU referendum is so telling at the moment. This is our assessment of what's really going on at the moment. The drive for EU military has been stepped up, and the latest is that NATO is contracted, that is the word, contracted to supply major units to operate under EU military command on search and rescue missions in the Adriatic. It's understood that the EU military control centre is now co-located in the Northwood bunker. This is the nuclear hardened facility in Northwood, which serves as the Maritime Operations Centre principally for the Royal Navy, but also other military operations. So the EU is now in that centre, and their cell is going to be expanded as its control over British forces and other European nation states increases. We point out that in that bunker there's already an EU anti-piracy control centre which is looking over after the maritime units, British units and others allocated to anti-piracy patrols. We'll also point out that we have specialist French army units. They've been in what was formerly RAF St Morgan down in Cornwall for some time. We don't know their precise role, but we find it very interesting that we've got these French army units sitting quietly. I'll just apologise if you can hear a little bit of background noise at the moment. It isn't the UK column. It's some work that's going on outside our facilities, so bear with us. It should only be a problem today. So the French army already on British soil, we don't know what they're doing down there in Cornwall. And we also understand from defence specialists that the EU has been dictating the cuts in British military force levels, and this is to make the British military easier to assimilate into a centralised EU military structure. And of course, it was only the UK column that exposed the start of this with the Franco-British Council's meetings in Paris and elsewhere. And we also now are pretty confident that Royal Navy warships are shortly expected to fly the EU flag alongside the White Ensign for EU-controlled operations. So this is this, Mike, is really dangerous stuff because, of course, if the EU succeeds in getting full control of our military and they set up the EU Treasury, it's a waste of time having any form of referendum or debate. And this is the treason, and I'm going to use that word deliberately at the moment, the treason by David Cameron and his government, because they know that while the British public is distracted, the EU is simply being given sovereign British assets.
I mean, it does give an indication as to what's in Cameron's mind, in the government's mind. Take that back a little bit because it's debatable whether David Cameron has a mind of his own. But the point is, he is busy. He's over in France with Hollande at the moment, making more agreements. Nothing's on hold while we wait for the referendum. The policy agenda moves forward in any case, and so either that means that they are pretty confident of the outcome, or it means it doesn't actually matter what the outcome is. They're just going to plow ahead anyway.
I think that's absolutely. If there's a vote to come out, then of course all of the people who are deeply concerned about what's happening in the country are going to relax. They're going to say, "Well, we've achieved that." But actually what will continue is everything that was happening before. And I'll see if I can bring it into perhaps tomorrow's news, but one of the Telegraph journalists has posted some interesting tweets where he's pointing out that the EU is absolutely reinforcing the fact that once you are engaged with the EU, the ratchet mechanism draws you in closer, and the EU is not going to walk away from that control mechanism.
Now, something that we've been warning about for many years in, for example, Martin Edwards' One World Governance series and other articles that we've written is the growing over-layering of corporatism on top of national governments and even pan-national governments like the EU. And so we get more indications of this. This is a spectacular article here because this is Larry Fink, who runs BlackRock. And as this article points out, BlackRock is far from a household name, but it is one of the largest hedge funds on the planet. $4.6 trillion in investment funds, funds under management. And that's, as the article points out, about $1 trillion more than the annual US federal budget and 5 times the assets of Goldman Sachs. This is one of these people are right at the top of the pyramid, and Larry Fink is in charge of that. Now, he has made it clear that he would like to be in charge of the US Treasury Secretary. Now, Hillary Clinton has received $675,000 for 3 speeches from Goldman Sachs, but she's had even more support from this organization. And so this is a layer of corporate control that perhaps nobody would like to see in any national government.
But it's emerging, Mike, isn't it? These are people, you just said BlackRock, largely unknown to people. Now they're coming to the surface and openly saying, well, actually, we'd like the controlling job.
Right. Now, I just wanted to highlight this tweet because if anybody has any doubt about whether this woman would accept such a man in that role, I think the eyes say it all, don't they? It's an incredible image. But let's look at another layer of this because this is another spectacular announcement. We don't have to wait for the US presidential election for this one to happen because this is another issue of corporate control. Eric Schmidt, who of course everybody knows was the former chief executive of Google, is now in charge of Google's parent company. He is going to be heading up a new, in quotes, advisory board to the Pentagon. It's going to be called the Defense Innovation Advisory Board. It's going to have 12 individuals sitting on it, all from the private sector. They would be expected to have led large private sector organizations or be leading large private sector organizations. And they would be expected to have excelled at identifying and adopting new technology concepts. They're expecting a first meeting to take place as early as in April. And the Pentagon spokesman said that the secretary, that's Ash Carter, is always looking for ways to keep the department thinking fresh, bring in new ideas, bringing in new voices, and he sees this as another opportunity to do that. But what we're looking at here is effectively a steering group, which is coming from the private sector right into the centre of the US Department of Defence.
Well, this is already the case in UK. We have universities pushing in people, and we picked up and covered the other day the fact that we've got these unvetted people coming in to brief the Defence Select Committee. And when we asked, well, what is the background of these people? Well, they're all linked through to Chatham House and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So essentially, policy for the nation, including defence, is being set by trusts, Soros-backed, Quangos, NGOs.
Yep.
Well, let's move to UK cities. We showed this a couple of days ago because Plymouth, like many other cities, is now rapidly moving to increase council tax. This was the Herald story that Plymouth City Council, desperate to bring in 1.8 million, which would be 33% of the required cut to adult social care. So the emotive story is the council needs this money because if it doesn't have the money, vulnerable people are going to suffer. We just pointed out that in their meeting, which was supposed to be vicious, We had Labour and Tories at each other's throats over money, where the lie is that there is no money. Well, of course, there's plenty of money, but this is all part of the international banking scam. But the other thing going on was that we've been told that Plymouth Social Services have been accused of attempting to steal property from elderly people who've become incapacitated. Then there's a charge put on their property, and then social services line themselves up to take that property to pay for the care. Somebody popped in yesterday and gave us this. It's part of Plymouth City Council's financial statements. And they pointed out that Plymouth City Council at the moment is sitting on usable reserves of a mere 58 million. But we can't actually look after vulnerable people, but we can sit on a pot of 58 million. And the other point is that the unusable reserves are apparently 181 million. I know the figures are very faint, but this is the real document at the bottom. That's the 58 million. And if I just bring in this arrow, this is the reserves of 181 million. Now, the reserve figure, interestingly, is in brackets, which normally in accounts indicates a negative figure. But having seen other documentation, we're pretty sure that what we're looking at here is 181 million squirreled away in overseas banks.
Yeah, or it could be in property. The usable reserves are in, or from what I saw yesterday, in medium-term or short-term investments. But what's interesting about this is that they are once again investing in banks overseas. It wasn't enough that they lost so much money with the Icelandic bank collapse in 2008. They're still doing that. And what's the other thing that's interesting is that they always attached to this, they have a document which lists institutions which have a credit rating suitable for investment, and yet they're still investing in institutions which don't meet the criteria for those credit ratings.
That's true. I haven't got the figures in front of me, but of course, if we take a police force, Devon and Cornwall Police, same thing, huge reserves, tens of millions of pounds held in reserves. And from what we've seen to date, and we'll have a further look at that, some of it in very strange places like South Africa. And perhaps the public's got a right to know where their money is being placed, even by a reliable organisation like Devon and Cornwall Police. But cities getting more power, Mike.
Well, this is a document from Brookings, and it's a US-based document, but it does make some interesting points that in the light of what you've just said might make people think. So what they're saying is here, while 95% of the largest cities in the US have seen aggregate job growth since 2009, according to this report, over 40% of cities have lost jobs in advanced industries. So we're seeing this reflected in the UK as well. This is the drive to push people into coffee serving and shelf stacking jobs while shutting down the high quality jobs, the high paying jobs. But what the report says, they highlight a number of areas that city leaders, in inverted commas, should be focusing on. They're saying they should be setting a mix of both long and short-term goals. They should set their sights on growth from within as opposed to recruiting companies from other locations. They should be focusing on boosting their economies through trade, and they should be prioritising people and skills. And of course, if you look at what's going on in UK cities, never mind in the United States, while these are all perhaps laudable ideas, that's not what we're seeing. Instead, we're seeing the common purpose at work, and the common purpose is that both short-term and long-term strategies are based on concentration of power rather than economic development, and hoarding cash in long-term investments that they can't be used for economic development.
And we got another indicator coming along, Mike, and that is, of course, that the NHS budgets are being given to local authorities. So Manchester, for example, the whole of the NHS budget now in control of the council. What that also brings is, of course, the fact that medical records, which you would like to think stay with medical trained people, are now freely available to people in your local council. Power base expanding and expanding.
Yes, and speaking of Manchester, here is a thanks to the person who sent this through to us. This is Salford Council. where they have they've written a public order notice which is banning people from swearing at Salford Quay. Well, these public space protection orders, they came into existence on one of the orders that replaced the antisocial behaviour order, and they came in under the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014, and they placed criminal restrictions. There are minimal restrictions placed on the use of these, and the main problem with this is that it basically leaves the thing completely open for councils to use them as they so wish. So part of this order says that anyone caught using foul and abusive language, but that is never defined. We never hear what foul and abusive language is. So basically, does criticising the council constitute foul and abusive language? Is that abusive language? We don't know. So a number of people making a point about this. Mark Thomas, the comedian, he is performing in the Lowry Arts Centre, and he's sending them a list of words that he intends to use to see whether he gets any response about whether he's allowed to use them or not. But the question is, where does this end? This public order orders, where do these end? Homelessness, is that a target for this? What about protest?
Well,
Speaker's Corner?
How are they listening to this bad language? Because, of course, here in Plymouth, we saw the idea muted. We don't know whether it's in place or not, and the public hasn't been told that lampposts were going to contain microphones in order to spy on people moving around Plymouth City Centre. So is the same thing happening in Manchester?
The penalty for this is a £60 fixed penalty notice, of course. I'd like to know how they're going to enforce that. If they stop somebody in the street, are they obliged to give their name? I don't think so.
We'll watch with interest.
Indeed.
But it's spooky stuff.
Right, The Guardian today. Ad blocking is a modern-day protection racket. So this is according to the Culture Secretary, John Whittingdale. And he is he's arguing that he's supporting the newspaper and music industries and others who are being hit by the fact that people have had enough of the amount of advertising they're seeing. And this was in a speech to the Oxford Media Convention. He said that fast-growing use of ad blocking software presents an existential threat to the newspaper industry. Well, I would suggest that actually what presents an existential threat to the newspaper industry is the fact that they're basically publishing raw propaganda as news at the moment, and people are seeing right through it and being turned off by it. Also, the fact that they are putting so much low-quality stuff on their program, on their websites and so on. He addressed the issue of the BBC, because the BBC is often criticised by commercial media, suggesting that because it's funded by what's effectively a tax, that it has unfair advantage. And he said the BBC does have an impact on online news provision, but my concern is that while the BBC may make it harder, it doesn't pose a threat to the survival, which I think ad blockers do. So he's in denial about why people use ad blockers. So let's have a look at it as an example. Here's the Daily Mail. And Daily Mail website, according to Ghostery and any other ad blocker that you choose to use, 17 advertising trackers. So you're being tracked by all sorts of corporations when you look at the Daily Mail. Social media, well, that's mainly social media buttons, share buttons, and so on. So if people are opting into using Facebook and Twitter and so on, well, then they're opting into being tracked, but they're not opting in to being tracked by these advertising companies. And they are definitely the biggest problem. So, of course, it's not all a bed of roses with regard to ad blocking, because as Cory Doctorow is pointing out here, ad blockers aren't themselves, don't necessarily have a clean slate. AdBlock Plus, for example, this company is charging advertisers fees to allow their ads through its filters, and they are also tracking what people are doing. Ghostery, which is the example I showed you a second ago, it blocks trackers, but unless you actually tell it not to gather what they call anonymized data about your browsing habits, then Ghostery is also tracking you. So there's that to consider as well. Now, there is a setting to switch that off, but do you trust them? That's another question. Then, of course, you've got the Electronic Frontier Foundation. These guys have created Privacy Badger. It doesn't track you. It's open source. You can see what it does. So you can use that one as well. And there's another point here, and that is that there's probably, well, it certainly limits the use of using a VPN if you assume that that's all that you need to do. Now, VPN, for those who don't know, is a virtual private network. It encrypts your traffic on the internet. So what that means is that if you use a VPN, then certainly your internet service provider can't pass your browsing habits on to government. But nonetheless, if you're doing nothing to prevent the tracking by advertisers and other Google and other organizations, you're still being tracked, and it's really defeating the purpose of using a VPN of some kind in the first place. But the bottom line here is that if people are worried about media company income, then perhaps if they're in government, they should be persuading Theresa May to stop the Snoopers Charter. They should be persuading Theresa May perhaps to act to limit the amount of tracking that's going on the internet in general, and perhaps people would be more willing to accept the advertising that they see.
I'd probably suggest, Mike, that persuading Theresa May would be persuading her to leave office in order to get somebody else in to do the job.
Indeed.
And it's being pointed out in our chat rooms that in Argyle Street, Glasgow, there's a 24 million Israeli system operating, which I think is operated by Strathclyde University, which can recognise the mood of people. So it's scanning facial images, and it can recognise what sort of mood you're in. And the question that's being posed is, so does this also understand what you are saying? Massive surveillance on a scale never really seen before. Couple it with a dictatorship, which is what is establishing itself in government, and we're in a serious position. Well, we're going to end on the subject of children and Barnardo's in particular, because yesterday we raised some concerns, and they centred around this gentleman who's part of Barnardo's senior team up in Scotland. He was tweeting out the Faith Toolkit, which is a Barnardo's initiative, which is supposedly to help schools support LGBTQ young people. But he was very keen that people knew that Gay Times was advertising this. Now, our graphics didn't work very well yesterday, so I'm just repeating a little bit of this before we show where it leads to. So here's Gay Times. This is the article. Barnardo's launched Faith Toolkit to help school children. And a gentleman called Singh Sidhu had contributed to the toolkit, said, what I love about this is it's actually working alongside schools, going into schools, talking about faith and sexuality, which are topics generally considered taboo and risky. I didn't know faith was a taboo and risky subject, Mike, but according to Barnardo's it is. And the resources have been put together by Barnardo's Positive Identity Service. So Barnardo's now helping children create their identity in collaboration with local schools, faith groups, gender and sexual orientation teams. If you're not too sure how you're orientated, then Barnardo's is going to help you choose. Now, what we took, we had an objection to was the fact that we're pushing out a message to do with very vulnerable children. And on this website, we described them as sexually explicit images. And we said to Barnardo's, would you like to comment that you've got senior staff members pushing out Barnardo's material about vulnerable children together with explicit material? The argument is not about the fact that the site is a gay site. It's an argument about the type of material being shown. Well, we got a response, and here it is. It's a remarkable email from Barnardo's. It says, "Hi Brian, what follows is not for the record. Our toolkit is about tackling homophobic bullying, and we're glad to have the support of a range of publications in helping us raise awareness for this issue. The toolkit is for professionals and community leaders, not children. We've spoken to the Gay Times, which assures us it does not permit any adult content on its website. If you have a complaint about the content on that website, do raise that directly with the publication, advertiser and/or Ofcom. Thanks for your interest in our work as a charity helping the UK's most vulnerable children." Well, that was a remarkable fob off, and I just sent back that, "Dear Zoe, having contacted you as a journalist for your comment as Barnardo's, Your response is absolutely for the public record, which is why I asked for a response. Do you wish to add to the response that you've already given? Well, they didn't. So I think we'll just put in the message here that Barnardo's, they don't really care about sexually explicit images. They're too busy protecting children, and you don't really know what you're talking about. Go away. So if you want to donate to Barnardo's, entirely up to you. I don't think I will be donating any further to Barnardo's until they clean their act up. Well, that brings us to the end of today's news. I'd just like to say thank you very much for the person who sent us a donation. It was a few days ago. Part of it was for Melanie Shaw, part of it was for the UK column. We have no way of getting in contact with you, but thank you very much. It will be put to very good use. And thank you also to all of you who continue to support UK column. We can only do what we do with your help. And we are going to be talking about, we're going to be talking in the future more about what we have been doing, what we can do, and certainly what we can do if our supporters will give us a little bit more help. But more on that in due course. We'll be back same time tomorrow, joined by David Scott with Northern Exposure, and we'll be having an in-depth look about what's happening in life and politically north of the border. Do join us. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.